but
you can cut this in post.
I can cut this in post. Hey everybody, it's Steve. Welcome to the Sunday Stoic. That was a live intro for you there. This is crudely recorded in my shed. And my guest today is Dr. John Saunders.
That would be me.
And Dr. Saunders is a rhetorician.
Yes, I am.
Would you tell us where you're currently employed?
I currently teach at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. And I'm in the communication department, which rhetoricians tend to come from communication, English, and sometimes philosophy. So my particular education and branding, if you will, comes from the communication side.
Okay. And in original Stoicism, the original package, there were three parts of the school, and we focus on ethics when we're mostly talking about how to live a virtuous life, one that seems fulfilling, where you don't feel like a dirtbag when you're laying on your deathbed, kind of a thing, which is always good. But
especially on deathbeds.
Especially on deathbeds. But there's also logic as well as physics, which was logic, the study of logic, as well as rhetoric and other things, and then physics, which was sort of the study of the world around them, and metaphysics and other things. I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about your field and the power of persuasion today.
All right. There's a lot to say about that. I mean, you go back, and I'm sure you've covered some of this scattered talking about various philosophers throughout time. You talk about the big three: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates was one who was searching for that ultimate capital T truth. Never found it, and they made him drink hemlock because he was a troublemaker.
Have a sip.
And he was the teacher of Plato. Plato was one who initially coined the term rhetoric. And honestly, Plato was really afraid of the power of persuasion. He saw how it could go so wrong and so bad on such a massive level. He was afraid and didn't want to teach it because he had to be careful. Because there were other teachers at the time, such as Gorgias, which if you look at Plato's Gorgias, that's where a lot of this comes into play. Gorgias was a pompous ass. And he was a teacher that would say, "Send me your sons, and I will teach them to persuade in the courts." But for him, the ends justified the means. He didn't care what he had to do as long as he won. I mean, he would show up to a town and say, "We're going to have a debate tonight. Me against whoever you want. You can tell me what the debate's about, and you can tell me which side you want me to argue, and I'll still win. I'm that good." Like I said, pompous ass. Now, Plato had a problem with that. He was the first one that said, no, you can't just go and use this skill and this ability on anyone to do whatever you want. Ethics needs to be a part of this. It should guide. And in Plato's Gorgias, he talks about a boxer who is technically proficient, could beat the crap out of anybody. But it brings up that question. Just because you can, does that mean that you should? Jeff Goldblum brought up the same question in Jurassic Park. Your scientists were so focused on whether they could, they didn't stop and think of if they should.
Nature finds a way.
Yes. So Plato was the one who said, we need to back this up. We need to think through how we persuade. and the different ways we try to persuade each other. How do we get ideas spread? And he would talk about logos, the use of logic, ethos, the use of credibility, which has the same root as ethics. He would talk about pathos, which is the use of emotion to persuade, and mythos, which I know a lot of books will overlook, but mythos is the use of culturally significant stories to try to persuade. I still think that's a big element. I like talking about mythos. And then you get to Aristotle, who Plato taught. Aristotle saw the benevolent and wonderful side of rhetoric. He saw how incredible it could be to get the masses to do things that were for the better good of everybody, to convince the public of what is right and what is morally good. This is how rhetoric should be used. So he created a systematic approach, a very scientific approach. All right, let's examine how people persuade, what works and what does not work. So that's where things like, was the speaker good looking? That's something Aristotle would think about. Whereas for the Stoic, that might not come into play. That's more about the
internal character of the speaker.
Right. Now, one other element that I want to bring up just specifically with Aristotle, this idea of kairos, which means the moment, the right moment, or as Van Halen put it, right here, right now. Finding the ultimate moment. When is it best to persuade? So taking into account character, taking into account these other means of persuasion, and finding the right time.
So the science of when to deliver this to have the greatest
Right.
effect.
Every single one of your listeners, I'd be willing to bet, when they were a teenager, if they wanted $20 from their parents to go out to a movie or to eat, they know the exact precise time of when it was best to ask either parent. Either right when they get home and they don't know what's going on yet, or you wait until you see a wallet out. All right, now's the opportune time. But it's finding the ripe moment. So not so much the right moment, but that ripe moment. What Lloyd Bitzer would call the rhetorical situation, which is where you have a moment that invites rhetoric, that invites persuasion specific to that moment with those specific people in that particular setting to come into being.
Now, how would could you give us an example then of mythos? How would you apply mythos to a situation like that? Or you're making an argument and you want to draw that into your argument? What are a few examples of that?
Actually, a good way to explain mythos is through the use of the enthymeme, which is, have you talked much about deductive reasoning, the basic syllogism?
These are things that I have on my horizon as approaching, but I've mostly focused on ethics so far. Just the things that most Stoics have, and even the Roman Stoics mostly focused on, were how to live a good life, how to be a good person. Those other values kind of got shoved on the back burner, but I think it's important to be a well-rounded person to focus on the other parts of the school as well.
Well, here's how this comes into play and how your listeners are going to see this every single day. The basic syllogism is if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. It's the fundamental element of logic, right?
Yep.
In the classic example, if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal. You have a premise, which is your claim, then you bring in the truth or the evidence, and then you come up with a conclusion based on that. Now, the way the enthymeme works, it's where you leave out the truth assuming that your audience knows and understands it. So if I said, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. I'm assuming my audience knows that all men are mortal.
I can't help but think of The Princess Bride right now. I'm sorry. Inconceivable. Anyway.
Absolutely. So, enthymemes. You shorten that down to meme. Memes that we see on the internet every single day actually rely on mythos. They give you a basic statement and show you a picture from pop culture. And then let you make the conclusion based on that. Now, to use mythos effectively, your audience has to know that pop culture reference. So if I create a meme and I have something like it's pizza day, and then I have a picture of SpongeBob SquarePants, who's known for that video and that song, It's the Best Day Ever. And I know I'm butchering that. But he had a song, It's the Best Day Ever, right? So when somebody sees that, it's pizza day, there's a picture of SpongeBob who said it's the best day ever. I get it. It's pizza day in the cafeteria. This is awesome. But to somebody who doesn't know who SpongeBob is, that meme is lost. That meme does absolutely nothing. It fails.
Like certain Far Side cartoons. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
So mythos is that use of a pop culture reference that you're assuming your audience will know and understand, and you're relying on that for your logic to work.
Before we hit the record button, you gave a reference to the O.J. Simpson case.
Yes. To where if I said basically what we have here is another bloody glove, for me to reference that, for most people, especially of our age, who remember the 90s, we remember the white Bronco. We remember Kato Kalin. We remember the entire circus that was the O.J. Simpson case. For me to use mythos and to use this enthymeme, I can mention the bloody glove, but then I leave it alone, assuming my audience is going to know, understand it, and make that connection. So really, enthymemes work by making the audience do some of the work, right?
And then you referred to, was it pathos was the use of emotion?
Yes.
And I think
logos is logic, ethos is credibility, and it's tied to ethics. Pathos is emotion, mythos, culturally significant story.
Okay, so I would say that you watch the news, you see a lot of the use of pathos as well as occasionally ethos, kind of like the use of authority. So-and-so said this. And then, of course, you see the use of emotion in, here in the States. I have a lot of listeners outside the States, but I think everyone understands that's part of our current condition.
Dilemma, whatever
it is. Yeah, where emotion is used quite often as a way to try to motivate certain parts of the populace to act or react to what they're saying.
Well, and we can use an example from right here in Arkansas where we're recording, even though I don't live here anymore. A few years ago, there was a vote in Arkansas that was going to allow the dry counties in Arkansas to vote for themselves whether they wanted to become wet counties or to stay dry, which means, for those of you who might not know, the county that we're in right now is dry, meaning that we cannot go to the grocery store and buy beer, wine, liquor. We have to go to a different county.
It takes me an hour round trip if I want to get a bottle of wine.
Yes. Now, you can go to a restaurant and get a glass of wine, But if you want to buy a bottle of wine and take it home, you have to go to a different county. Part of the campaign against that referendum, it was actually liquor stores on the edges of dry counties and churches that were working together, that were creating ads that said, you don't want a liquor store across the street from your child's elementary school, do you? Well, the thing is, legally, they couldn't do that. But in the ads, they were able to create that fear in the populace. Even though legally that couldn't happen, it made people afraid that it might. And so that made them vote a certain way. So there's plenty of examples throughout history of how emotion has been used to manipulate a populace to vote a certain way.
So with your background then, whenever you see any kind of election campaign or propaganda piece, if you will, you are analyzing it from the base of your knowledge. You're applying your knowledge to that situation and saying, oh, here's what they're doing. Is that something that comes natural to you now, to kind of tear apart what you're seeing and break it down?
Actually, it does, but in a way, I also have to be able to turn it off, to be able to enjoy pop culture, right? For me to watch a film and enjoy it, I need to be able to watch it as a fan, but I also need to have that ability to turn it on to where I can look at a film as a cultural critic to make comments about how a certain film is reflecting our culture, how it's trying to create culture, how it's trying to bash culture. So in many ways, to get to this mindfulness idea that you've talked about.
Living in the moment, yeah.
Yes. I think it's also important to be able to turn that off as a critic. Because if you try to analyze everything, that's exhausting and frustrating.
I have an interview that the listeners may have heard by the time they hear this with Kai Whiting, who is advocating that we think about the ethical implications of a lot of the things we do, like buying canned tuna and how tuna is harvested and whether the shoes you buy are made in a sweatshop,
right,
and all of that. But you do have to bear in mind at some point you have to live and not just sit there and analyze everything and get nowhere. You have to figure out what is important to you and then draw those boundaries and say, I'm going to make the world better this way, and there are some things that I just have to live with because I can't fix everything.
Right. And you can't solve everything. You can't make an impact on everything. It's something that I actually teach to my students. You want to be able to use your voice to create positive change in this world, but you need to make decisions about that. What are the things that you care about most? That's where you need to start. You don't have to pick a fight with everything. I mean, personally, there's one massive store based here in Arkansas that I don't shop in because I don't like the way they treat small businesses. That's the one that I picked for me. I don't shop there. If people ask me about it, I inform them. But there are other things like certain restaurants that have had owners say this or a reputation, they've done this or had this one practice. You can't fight for everything. What's most important is to think critically about what you can. Make your stand, but you have to be able to turn it off. Because otherwise you're going to drive yourself nuts. That's part of it. There's too many things in this world that are messed up for one human to ever fully understand a few of them, let alone all of them. So I think being mindful, number one, it's being mindful of the situation you're in and how are you reacting within the situation you commonly find yourself, let alone trying to go out and find other situations for you to react
Seeking
to.
more things to worry about may not be the best thing to do. For those of you listening, we are currently drinking. What's the bourbon? We're not being terribly temperate this evening. John and I have John and I build cigar box guitars together. We've talked about them before. You've heard them. I opened up the podcast today with a live playing of a cigar box guitar for the introduction. We build cigar box guitars, and we also have a love of various distilled spirits, and we are enjoying some today, as well as a couple of cigars. What is the whiskey we're enjoying this evening, John?
The whiskey of the evening is Heaven's Door, which is the Bob Dylan double-barreled whiskey. So they let it age in one barrel and then put it in a brand new one and let it age again. So it comes up with a nice, robust flavor.
To be enjoyed, not to be guzzled. And I'm enjoying it immensely this evening. Thank you for bringing it, John.
Well, it was kairotic. It was the right time for the right.
It's a kairotic beverage. Cheers.
Did you hear that?
I'm sure they did. So we're enjoying Friendship, which those critical of the Stoics, especially back in the day, would say, well, the Stoics don't really care about friendship, but we know that that's not true. That living in a society, and being a human being within society, it's natural to have friends and to enjoy yourself, and you just want to ensure that what you're doing doesn't cross your own moral boundaries in the process. John and I don't go out guzzling whiskey and then get behind the wheel and do stupid things and then end up in the newspaper. We're enjoying things responsibly.
But also to the point that you're making here, what we're also doing within this idea of mindfulness, it's tough to be mindful of things in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
Because then you only get one side of the story, and that's your own. Part of critical thinking, and any textbook on critical thinking, any book on rhetoric is going to tell you that you need to involve more than one voice. I mean, that's one element of persuasion that is a critical part. Having an opposition in there. I mean, that's something, if you read Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss.
I do that quite often at this point in my life.
That book, the entire book is about persuasion. You have the unnamed character continually trying to get, or you have Sam trying to get the unnamed character to eat green eggs and ham, right?
Yep.
So, how does he do it?
Would you like them in the train? Would you like them in the rain? Would you like them in a boat?
Well, it starts with, would you like green eggs and ham?
That's the initial premise, yes.
So then he takes this attempt at persuasion. All right, I asked him straight up, no strings attached. Now, let me come up with all of these different options that I can give you with things that you're familiar with to combine this unknown to help introduce you to it. Because that's actually part of what's called the uncertainty reduction theory. It says that when we know we're going to experience the unknown, we either bring something that's familiar with us or we try to research it so that when we get there, the unknown is minimal. So combining that which is known in a house with a mouse, in a train, in the rain, those are all attempts to pair the known with the unknown.
On a side note, I just think it's interesting. This is obviously unscripted. This is a genuine conversation here. That book by Ward Farnsworth on Stoicism, he mentions that one aspect of Stoicism is one of the benefits, one of the psychological benefits of Stoicism is you can attempt to kind of short circuit reality in a way, in that you're trying to understand how, let's say you lived for 100 years, you would, or 1,000 years, let's say 1,000 years, you would know what it's like to lose people you care about, right? Or even, like, I think in his book, he talks about you're a doctor. You know what it's like to lose a patient. You know what it's like to lose 100 patients. Think about that doctor 900 years in the future losing his 1,000th patient, not really due to any fault of their own. You would accept it kind of philosophically. This is what happens. Mm-hmm. Stoicism kind of gives you that. One of the things of Stoicism, like premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of what could happen, kind of gives you that fortitude to think about what could happen. So if it does, you are a little more prepared to accept it and not be shook by it. I think.
But there's also the difference there of what happens in theory versus what happens in reality. Mm-hmm. There's so many things that you can never fully be prepared for.
That is true. And even the Stoics have this idea of a sage, which is kind of like the Jesus, like the perfect Stoic.
Or the dude.
The dude. They will also feel the pangs of, oh, crap, all right? But then they can bring in their logic shortly thereafter and frame what has happened. You're still going to have that initial emotional response and what have you, but you can then frame it with logic, if you will, to say, okay, well, in the big picture, this is not an unheard of thing to happen. You know, people die, cars crash, houses need repair, whatever it is, you can frame it and say, this is not something that's never happened to anyone before. This is something that's happened to people throughout the ages, and then use that to help you deal with it more calmly, perhaps. Then it doesn't mean you're not going to have more work to do, but you can accept it a little more rationally than like, oh crap, why does this happen to me? It doesn't happen to anybody else. No, I'm going to be really mad.
Right.
You can kind of frame it that way.
To think beyond yourself.
Right.
That even though so many things happen that are beyond my control, that doesn't mean that there's a wall in between them and me. That idea of not being alone.
Mm-hmm. You're part of the Cosmopolitan Hole. You're part of the group.
Yes, which I believe any of the philosophers from 2,000 years ago, none of them existed or tried to create in a vacuum. Each one of them wanted to know, here's what other people have said, now here's what I can add to this. And I want to know, especially with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they were all teachers. They wanted to know what their students had to say. So there was this continual engagement of others.
And we can do that today. I mean, if
we're doing that right now.
If you are a hard leftist, let's say, and Donald Trump says, in amongst the other things that drive you crazy, says one thing that you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. You don't want to reject it because of the messenger. You want to listen to that. You can learn. You can take one piece of what someone said, even if you disagree with 99% of what they say, and use that one piece if it seems to make sense to you, I think.
But I think therein lies part of the challenge. To be able to think critically and to exclude preconceived notions. To look at something on its own terms. Here's what this is presenting, as opposed to saying, well, here's what somebody presented and they're an ass.
Is that the ad hominem fallacy?
Yes.
I think you're more versed with the fallacies than I, but I think that one's ad hominem. Well, this person said it. So,
yes.
Like if Hitler said blue skies are pretty, and you're like, well, screw Hitler, blue skies suck, that would be a problem.
Well, and there's actually There is a fallacy I don't think I created, but I helped name, at least for the workbook that's here at UCA for those who are in the communication department and take the class. Ad absurdum de Hitlerum, which is the fallacy of reducing something to, well, that's what Hitler would do.
And that's
what Hitler would have said.
That's an incredibly common argument these days. Well, Hitler would have done that.
Online, yes.
Online.
They say that every argument ends up with Hitler.
Can be reduced down to, well, Hitler ate pancakes, so screw pancakes.
But right, the ad hominem is where you attack the person as opposed to the argument. So if I said so-and-so is stupid, rather than saying so-and-so's recent policy has many flaws.
And here they are.
At least one is focusing on the argument, not on the person.
Gotcha.
But yes, that's part of what I teach. Part of teaching rhetoric is teaching critical thinking.
So an everyday individual who's not studying rhetoric, why is it important? I think it's important for someone studying, if they're making a philosophy, let's say it's Stoicism. It might not be. It might be Epicureanism. It might be nothing that's ancient at all. It might be whatever, but let's say they're wondering why is an understanding of persuasion and rhetoric important for the modern individual to understand when they're engaging with the world, when they're voting, when they're making decisions in their everyday life. Why is this something they should keep in mind?
Excellent question. Here's where all of this connects. Here's where all of this comes together. Part of understanding rhetoric and how people are going to try to persuade you is part of being a critical consumer. And I mean that a critical consumer of ideas, of politics, of culture, of products. Being a critical consumer means that you ask questions about what our society, through billboards, through advertising, through magazines, television, the internet, through clothing. What do they try to persuade us to do? Or what do they try to persuade us to think? Part of understanding rhetoric is understanding how are they doing it? How is McDonald's trying to make me want a McMuffin with egg and bacon? How are they doing it?
Oh, sorry.
That's part of it. They give me something that can get stuck in my head. They show me pictures of bacon.
And happy people eating bacon.
Happy people eating bacon. They show pictures of a Wi-Fi signal made out of French fries. That makes me think, ooh, I want to go there. McDonald's is one very big and very obvious example to use here. But even the way stop signs are designed, they're designed to persuade. They look a certain way, have a certain color with the word stop to make you act a certain way. Signs of every shape, size, and color. Billboards, clothing, all advertisement. Every single day, each person is going to have possibly thousands of attempts to change how they think about something or how they act or what they buy. Being a critical consumer and understanding rhetoric gives you a tool to be able to ask those questions about how these companies, how these individuals are trying to do that. And the more critically you can analyze how they're trying to persuade you, the better you can make your decisions based on all of those attempts.
What are some resources or books that someone could access to help build these?
Actually, the first book I would look for is Plato's Gorgias, and look for the W.C. Hembold translation. I like that translation because it's very easy to access. There's some translations that were written in the 1500s that it's hard to get into that prose, right?
King James kind of prose,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
W.C. Hembold's translation of Plato's Gorgias, where Plato asked that ultimate question. It's a dialogue between Socrates and Gorgias about the nature of persuasion. How does it work? And what do we need to think about? Because, like I said, that's where Plato introduced the idea of ethics. It said you can't do this without thinking about the ethical ramifications of this. So this is something that I make my students read an excerpt of in a regular public speaking class, because I want them, if I'm going to teach them how to persuade publicly, I want to know they understand ethics. So Plato's Gorgias would be the first place, or the first text that I would look up.
I know many of those texts are available public domain. I don't know about this translation, maybe when they need to purchase.
I think I found it on Amazon for $6.95.
Well worth the investment.
So it's I think 112 pages.
If I remember, if we can, you shoot me the link, we'll put it on the show notes, and someone could click on it and pick it up if they want to.
I highly recommend that version, and it's a great place to start to understand what rhetoric is and the potential that rhetoric has, and some of the things that we should think about when we're trying to persuade, as well as when others are trying to persuade us.
Excellent. Well, thank you, John.
Oh, absolutely. This was a lot of fun, and I've been looking forward to sitting down with you and having this conversation.
Excellent. Well, and the bourbon didn't hurt.
Oh, absolutely. I enjoyed that.
All right, everybody. Well, Dr. John Saunders, if anyone has questions about this, should they email me and I'll tell you, or do you want them to contact? John accidentally gave the wrong email address here. His actual email address is jhs0011@uah.edu. That's Juliet Hotel Sierra 0011@uniformalphahotel.edu. jhs0011@uah.edu. All right.
That's my, because I teach at University of Alabama in Huntsville. You can find me on the communication faculty website, and that's my email address. I'd be happy to talk about this further with any of those that may be interested.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
Greatly enjoyed.
Thank you for listening to the Sunday Stoic podcast. You can contact the show at sundaystoic@gmail.com. You can leave a voicemail for the show at 501-503-3132. And keep in touch by following us on Facebook and Twitter. You can support the show by donating on Patreon, www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. You can also help us out by rating us on iTunes or whichever podcast provider you use. Thank you for your support. Carpe diem.